All right, thank you, everyone. Ooh, can we turn the volume down a little bit? So a little better. Welcome to both our virtual audience on Zoom as well as our audience in person. We want to thank Urbana Public Television for being here in person with us today. So their recording will also be available at a later time as well. I did want to remind everyone that after the presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for question and answer. So if you have any questions online, please feel free to throw those in the Q&A portion. And then for our in-person audience, I will be running around with a microphone at the end of this. Lastly, after the presentation, if you could fill out our evaluation. For those of you here in person, there's a QR code hanging out on your tables. I'll also put it up on the screen at the end. And then for those of you on Zoom, I will post that in the chat. Otherwise, I'd like to welcome up Ross Montland so he can tell us a little bit about what's going on this weekend and our speaker today.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see everyone, and it's so good to be in person with you all. My name is Ross Montland. I use he, him pronouns. I work with the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion on campus, and I'm one of several of us here in the room who are part of the Campus Interfaith Planning Committee that annually puts on the Illinois Interfaith Conference. We are excited to partner with the Friday Forum Conversation Cafe to bring Reverend Jen Bailey here to campus, who's amazing, and I'm not going to eat up the bio time, so we'll get to hear more about Jen. But I do want to thank some of our partners who have made this happen. The conference is sponsored in large part by the Illinois Interfaith Alliance of Champaign County, the Religious Workers Association, the Department of Religion, and Diversity and Social Justice Education, as well as the University YMCA and the Office of Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you so much to the RWA and the Interfaith Alliance, because their presence and their support have been really invaluable throughout the conference and throughout these events. If you are interested in attending other components of the Interfaith Conference, and I would dare say that after you get to hear Jen talk, you probably will be, there are 2 more moments to hear Jen talk. One is tonight at our opening session at 7 o'clock at the Eikenberry SDRP. One is tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Dr. Ira Helderman. That is about collective care, healing, resilience, and mental health. And so thinking about spiritual wellness, mental health, and what that looks like. And so hopefully you'll be excited, check that out. There are flyers out on the table. Please, we hope to see you there. I get to introduce the introducer, which I'm excited about. So I get to introduce Reverend Terence Thomas. And Reverend Terence Thomas is an itinerant elder with the African Methodist Church and the pastor of Bethel AME Church here in Champaign, Illinois. Terence and Pastor Thomas and I were just talking about how he really doesn't like cold introductions, and so I apologize in advance for this sort of cold introduction. But Pastor Reverend Thomas is the executive director of the Bridgewater Sullivan Community Life Center, which is a faith-based nonprofit here in Champaign. Reverend Thomas is also the vice president of the CU Ministerial Alliance. As a dedicated liberation theologian and unapologetic Black nationalist, Reverend Thomas received his undergraduate degree in inner city studies with a minor in sociology from Northeastern Illinois University and a master's of divinity from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Reverend Terence Thomas is the father of 5 beautiful children, ages 25, 23, 19, 13, and 6. So to help us welcome Jen Bailey, I want to welcome up Pastor Terence Thomas.
Thank you so much for that introduction. A little over 1 year ago, we witnessed something that we probably never thought we'd experience in this country, a coup d'etat, an attempted coup that happened on January 6th. So in the history of America, when we talk about Pearl Harbor, when we talk about 9/11, We talk about the attack on Fort Sumner, we have to add January 6th. What makes it even more complex is the seeds of this coup d'etat was planted in faith communities. The very thing that's supposed to give us life began to promote death. For the longest time, this country's been in the present darkness. Faith leaders have forgotten that our mandate is to divine, to humanity, to love. In my tradition as a Christian pastor, though, I'm told that every now and then God sends a remnant, a prophet, someone to remind us, someone to light the light, someone to illuminate the way. And that is the Reverend. I did not know Reverend Bailey before this morning, but in the short time, she told me something that I thought was profound and amazing. Pastor pastors, that's so many words. I reinvigorate, I build bridges, and I heal spiritual leaders who are burnt out by this work. And believe me, we can get burnt out by this work. This morning, we see on the news war. It gets tiring to hold the line, and it's good to know that somebody is holding us. She is the creator of the Faith Matters Network. She is my sister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And you can tell by 5 minutes of conversation, she takes this work seriously. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce the Reverend Jennifer Bailey, who will bless us and illuminate the way. Reverend Bailey.
So in our church tradition, we say, my, I'm gonna have to take Reverend Thomas with me everywhere I go. For an introduction, thank you so much for being here today. What a blessing it is to be in your presence in this moment. I know you could have been a lot of other places. So my hope is that this will be an opportunity for us to suspend time for just a moment, breathe deep, and be present with one another. And so I'm actually going to invite you for a second to take a minute of breath and pause. We are living at a time literally of a pandemic that is seeking to steal our breath in a world in which the social conditions seek to steal our attention. So if you will with me, let's just take a breath for 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us both virtually and here in person for this Friday Forum talk, which I call Can You Hear the Women Wailing? Reflections on faith, race, loss, and radical hope. On February 5th, 1920, Georgia Gilmore was a Montgomery cook, midwife, and activist whose secret kitchen fed the civil rights movement. In December of 1955, after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white man, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black ministers and community leaders led what became known as the Montgomery bus boycott. Yet when King and others who are part of the Montgomery Improvement Association held meetings, it was Georgia Gilmore who was there. You see, Miss Gilmore would sell fried chicken sandwiches and other foods to the African-American men and women who gathered and pledged not to use the city buses. Gilmore then poured those profits back into the movement. In the process, her home kitchen became a locus for change and revolution. She was, with other Black women, selling pound cakes and sweet potato pies, fried fish and stewed greens, pork chops and rice at beauty salons, cab stands, and churches. These women, these unnamed women, women who are not often a part of the history books and how we tell the story of the Southern Freedom Movement, formed a project that they called the Club from Nowhere. Because, as Betty Gilmore, Georgia's sister, said years later, it was like Where did this money come from? It came from nowhere. You see, so often when we tell the story of the Southern Freedom Movement and our movements for social change, the story of the Black women who serve as the locus and bedrock for these movements are not at the forefront. We know the name of Rosa Parks. We are beginning to know the names of people like Diane Nash and Ella Baker. But Georgia Gilmore is not a name that we know. As we think about this history of our social movements, it is Black women who have, from time immemorial, been at the core and center of so many of our movements for social change. Women who toiled, who sold fish dinners, who did the work, who did the labor, but did not necessarily get the shine. I have a mentor of mine, a womanist ethicist, who says that Black women in the United States have never had a vision of liberation that wasn't inclusive of everyone. For we know, as people whose very embodiment speaks to a nexus of intersecting oppressions, that none of us are free unless all of us are free. Women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, the only thing I really feel is necessary is that Black people, not only in Mississippi, where she was from, will have to actually upset the apple cart. What I mean by that is, so many things are under the cover that we will have to be swept out and shown to the whole wide world, not just to America. This thing, they say, the land of the free and the home of the brave, is all on paper. It doesn't really mean anything to us. The only way that we can make this thing a reality in America is to do all we can to destroy the system, the unjust systems, and bring forth out of the light that which has been undercover all of these years. Now, I don't know about you all, but I feel like I've been living in an apocalypse over the past 5 to 10 years. And when I think about the term apocalypse, going back to the Greek root of the word, it means to uncover. And what we've seen uncovered over the past 5 years has been what I would argue is the truth of some of the broken wounds and original sins of our nation. The uprisings around racial justice over the past 10 years, the assault on our democracy, all speak to, at our core, some of the challenges that have always been there. And once we uncover something, it's hard to cover it back up. Fannie Lou was a prophet before her time, understanding that in order for us to realize the potential of our nation as a multi-faith, multi-racial, when we think about the experience of Black women in the United States, Melissa Harris Perry, the political scientist and commentator, writes in her book, Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes in Black Women in America. If you ask most people what they think when they hear the word politics, they're likely to give a definition that includes things like voters, parties, elections, public policies, and processes for contestation and representation. But formal participation in government is only part of a more encompassing effort to be recognized within our nation. The struggle for recognition is at the nexus of human and national identity, where much of the important and most important work of politics occurs. African-American women fully embody that struggle. By studying the lives of Black women, we gain important insight into how Black women and other citizens yearn for and work towards recognition. To understand Black women's politics, we must often explore their often unspoken experiences of hurt, rejection, and a search for identity. So one of the things that happened in the 2020 election is I began to see with my friends headlines like this. Black women proved to be the backbone of American democracy. Black women save democracy. Black women proving to be a force for elections. To protect Black women and save America from itself, we must elect Black women. I was exhausted. When I think about what it means for Black women so often to have the experience of needing to carry the weight of their community on their back, it felt like a part of a much more longer narrative of what it means for Black women to step into not only leadership, but this role of savior in our country. Again, Melissa Harris Perry writes that when they confront race and gender stereotypes, Black women are standing in a crooked room, and they have to figure out which way is up. Bombarded with warped images of their humanity, some Black women tilt and bend themselves to fit this distortion. So often our experience of Black women and as Black women falls into one of three historic stereotypes. The Jezebel, the hypersexualized Black woman, the mammy, the all-encompassing, self-sacrificing, docile woman who cares for others, and the sapphire, the angry Black woman. I don't know about you, but when I read headlines like this, headlines that often ask for Black women to take a stand without giving or investing in Black women's leadership, it feels like, to me, that we're asking Black women to be mammies for our democracy. To step into a space of caring for others without both seeing, recognizing, and investing in them, in their wellness and their leadership. It reduces us to what we can do for America's democracy and not recognizing the fullness and totality of our lived experiences. You see, it is my experience that Black women often lead out of a space of their deep experiences of pain, lament, and grief. What it is to be and move as a Black woman in America is necessarily both, as Malcolm X said, to be dismissed all of the time, but also to have a third eye towards the pain of the world. In my faith tradition, there is a scripture in the verse of Jeremiah 9:17-20, that speaks to the role of wailing women. Women who, in the ancient text, were assigned the role of identifying and lamenting, of naming the challenges and problems that were before them. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Consider now, call for the wailing women to come. Send forth the most skillful of them. Let them come quickly and wail over us till our eyes overflow with tears and water streams from our eyelids. The sound of wailing is heard from Zion. How ruined are we? How great is our shame? We must leave our land because our houses are in ruins. Now you women, hear the word of the Lord. Open your ears to his words. Teach your daughters how to wail. Teach one another to lament. Death has climbed into our windows and has entered our fortress. It has removed the children from the streets and young men from the public squares. Now, you may not come from an Abrahamic tradition where this is part of your sacred text, but what this recognizes, what I recognize in this is the experience of so many of my sisters, of my grandma, of my aunties, of so many Black women who have wailed in our democracy. Women like Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, who wailed for our democracy, not allowing us to turn our eyes from the reality of the brutality of her son's murder, thus thrusting us into a new recognition in the struggle for Black rights in the United States and civil and human rights in the United States. I see contemporary mothers, mothers of the movement as they're called, mothers of young men who have been killed by state violence, wailing and calling us to lament, to calling us into a space of recognition that the world that is before us is indeed broken, but there is an opportunity for us to change the material conditions that are before us. I recognize these women. These are the women that served as the background and backbone of my life growing up. About 3 hours west of here at Bethel AME Church in Quincy, Illinois, where I was raised. The women of my church, the church mothers as we call them in my tradition, they were women who were the child and children of Jim and Jane Crow. They were women who had seen some things, had lived through the horror of state violence, had lived through the horror of domestic violence in their towns, and still held on to a radical notion of hope in the midst of it. And when I talk about hope, y'all, I'm not talking about like some fluffy thing that we aspire for way out there. Indeed, the faith and hope of the church mothers in my childhood was rooted. And so I get like really nerdy, go back and look at the etymology of words. And so the root of the word radical is rooted. And in my new book, I talk a little bit about these church women and what they taught me. And I thought I'd read a little bit from it for you. The church mothers of my childhood were progenitors of a lineage of social healing grounded in radical hope. For them, hope was and is not the same thing as optimism. It is not a feeling or a desired future state that is the substance of our longings. Hope is the everyday practice of believing that the material conditions of the world can be better and that we have the capacity to bring about that change in the here and now. How is this definition of hope radical? Today, we use the term radical most often in political context to describe a fundamental shift in policy, radical reform, or people on the extreme ends of an ideological spectrum. Yet the origin of the word in the English language of the word radical is rooted or having roots. The hope of my foremothers is indeed rooted. Its tendrils reach deep into the histories, riddle the stories of trauma and triumph, grief and glee, drama and delight, from the western coast of Africa to the fields of the Mississippi Delta. Radical hope is just one expression of what the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce calls grandmother theology. Grandmother theology, according to Pierce, is a subset of womanist thought grounded in the generational wisdom that is only possible with the maturity forged by the passage of time. It provides an alternative way to understand and know the divine by transporting us back several generations. Along the way, the church women in my life helped me uncover 3 characteristics of radical hope, each of which is tied to a central question that I believe the world is yearning for now. The first is memory as an antidote to death. Death is indeed a part of a life cycle, and one might diagnose what we're dealing with now as the death of many things, as we mourn the death of over 900,000 people lost to COVID, as we mourn the death in this pandemic of hopes and dreams that people thought that they would have, or experiences people thought they would have over the past 2 years. But I know that we must live and we must die. That is the fact of life. The church mothers in my life taught me that in our tradition, death does not have the final say. The ability to access those who have come before is as simple as calling their name. When we remember, even the painful things, we transcend the limits of time and space and allow their stories of those who we've lost to anchor and accompany us. Institutions, like people, formed and made by people, are also subject to a life cycle. This means that they too inevitably must die in their current form. Collective memory helps us glean the lessons from our historical institutions and discern that which is useful and that which we must carry forward in this season, and how to let go of that which isn't serving us anymore. That's my way of saying, y'all, some stuff is dead and dying and needs to stay dead. That's disturbing for people in my church tradition, because they know that many churches are closing, right? But I would argue that in this season of our nation's life, knowing how to tend to loss, knowing how to tend to death, and knowing how to discern that which is useful for us to carry forward and compost, and that which needs to stay dead, because some stuff needs to stay dead, y'all, is important. So the core question here that I reflect on often as I look at the world around us is, what is dying here? Second, the second lesson that the church mothers taught me, these Black women who were radical in their own right, is that imagination is a pathway to resurrection. In my own tradition, the Christian tradition places a great deal of value on the concept of resurrection. The belief that in our tradition, Jesus died, lived, and rose again is a central tenet of my faith. From the church mothers, I learned the same creative spirit in my tradition that allowed Jesus to raise folks from the dead exists within us. For folks who may not belong to the Christian tradition, it is the notion that within our very beings, we have the power to materially change the world before us if we have the creativity to imagine something different. So the question here is about what it means to slow down and pay attention to that which is yearning to be, that which might be animating on the very peripheries of your imagination. What are y'all dreaming about these days? Maybe that's not a question you get asked very often, but I have a 17-month-old son, and so it is something I ask myself often. What am I dreaming about for Max? But the core question here, along with what are you dreaming about, is what wants to emerge in this season? What is dying? What wants to emerge? And finally, the church mothers taught me that living is indeed a testament to the possibility of the present. There is something radical in the notion, as my church mothers used to tell me, to just keep living, baby. Whenever I would complain, whenever I would be exhausted and depleted, they would tell me with a hint in their eye, a little glisten in their eye, just keep living, baby. That wasn't a way of dismissing my problems. No, they tended to me. They sat with me in the muck of my mess, right? In the muck of it all. But they also helped me know, these women who had survived some of the greatest unspoken horrors that I can imagine, that if you just keep living, there is the possibility for transformation. They understood that their faith is not the absence of doubt, but that faith is trust in the absence of certainty. When we let go of our obsession with certainty, our attempts to exercise control over our future or to replay the mistakes of our past, we find ourselves better able to see the miracles that are happening even now. Even now. It can be really So the question tied here is, what is already blooming beautifully in the world? So just to reflect back for you all, 3 questions in radical hope that ground us. What is dying? What wants to emerge in the world? What I found in my life journey is that I often ask these questions and see that there are answers, and that there is always something that is dying. There is always something that wants to emerge. And if you pay close attention to it, there is already something that is blooming beautifully in the world. And that indeed is the nexus of radical hope. When we lose our ability to imagine, when we lose our ability to think creatively, when we lose our ability to speak dreams into existence, that is when hope is dead. And so when I think about the Black women in my life, both the church mothers and my colleagues and peers and friends, they are the contemporary versions of Linda Gilmore. They are the women who have chosen to not choose pessimism, but who've chosen to live and embody radical hope. Not to be the mammies of democracy, but because they believe that there can be something different for themselves, for their children, and for the 7 generations from now. And I get excited when I think about the possibilities. It's surprising when I get excited, but I get excited when I think about what it means to begin to envision a new world, a new version of our democracy in which everyone finds a place to belong. That vision, again, that Black women have had, in which liberation is not limited to one group of people, but is open to everyone. And so with that, I said thank you, and I'm really excited to talk to y'all. So thanks, y'all. So my favorite thing in the world, I was told I would stay here for people online. Hi, folks. My favorite thing in the world is actually to be in dialogue. And so I'm really curious for folks who are gathered both online and here. What is dying? What wants to emerge? And what is blooming beautifully in your life right now? You can take any or all of those questions. You can also ask me questions, whatever is live for you right now. Yeah, what's your name?
Sam.
Hi, Sam.
Yeah, I go to the church that's actually across the. I go to the church that's across the street from the next door, and we're going through a tough time. You know, we're struggling to find where we are because we don't have a pastor right now, and it's I guess it's. I'm not sure if it's dying or if it's, but it's certainly hard to sometimes see where it's going. And, but, you know, the community that we have been strong. So I do have hope that, you know, we can change things to be better in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not alone. There's so many people in local congregational contexts who are experiencing sort of the death of the old way we used to do and practice religious community together. So it helps me sometimes when I'm grieving and a death to know that I'm not alone. And there's so many people who are walking right there with you. Thank you so much for sharing, Sam. Yeah, right here.
Yeah, I'm Jewish, and so I really, what you said about history is one of the things that Jews have always had a history that has been taught, and so it's just part of our DNA. Oh, okay. I'm Jewish, and historically, we've always had a fraught history with a lot of violence and a lot of death and things. So radical hope really resonates with me because that's really how Jewish people have managed to survive. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism right now, and we, you know, it's almost like you said before about I think some candidates have been ripped off. I think some of us have been here for a while, and in some ways it's good to see what was going on, and then it's easy to fight.
Yeah, thank you for that. The role of history and tradition and lineage and making sure we tell the story is so important. My husband is Jewish, and so I'm a member of Weston Synagogue in Nashville, Tennessee, in addition to my local church. And so one of the great gifts that I've learned accompanying Ira in his journey has been this role of telling the story and remembering, and remembrance as a key to unlocking the sort of resources we need to be able to tell the truth of this uncovering moment, this apocalyptic moment, while also moving through to something different. So thank you so much for that offer.
Okay, my name is Courtney. I just want to say thank you for sharing your work with us. I'll be a question, maybe more of a comment. Just either hear your thoughts or just something to linger, but I've just been thinking about like the tension between like faith or like unseen and hope with like history and like you know, just remembering like the bad and the good, I guess everything, but then not like ways to like try not let that, I don't know, it's hard, like realizing or recognizing what is or accepting what has happened and what's happening, and then that alongside being open to possibilities beyond that, or like, you know what I mean? So I think that's just, I think, you know, this presentation just brings up, you know, that part as far as like, you know, just what I'm thinking about as far as like faith aligned with knowing and remembering and then like living or acting alongside that. But I'll stop there. But yeah, thank you again for your presentation.
Oh, no, that's so brilliant. Thank you so much, Courtney. What your comments are sort of churning up in me is thinking about my own family story, right? And I think one of the things that is true in this moment is that truth in history is being contested in a very real way, publicly in legislatures around the country, right? There's a blocking of how we tell our history in this moment. And in particular, how we tell the truth of our history in this moment. And so that we have that happening in a very real assault on the truth of history on a macro level. But I think about like the micro level stuff of my grandmother passed away last August. She would have been 90 last month. She was my last living grandparent and the apple of my eye. A very sassy apple of my eye. And one of the things that I know to be true, and I'm just speaking from my family's experience as the direct descendant of slaves, product of the Great Migration. So my grandmother migrated to Cairo, Illinois, not Cairo, but Cairo for folks who know Southern Illinois well, from Southern Georgia. And it wasn't until the end of her life that she began to tell me stories about what her experience was like growing up in Southern Georgia and Northern Florida in the 1930s and 40s. I didn't know until I started to do research for my book that when she was 11 years old, one of her neighbors was lynched, right? And so I think there's a way for some communities that out of a desire to protect us, younger generations, that elders have held back the truth of their history or haven't wanted to tell it. But we also know that trauma imprints on our DNA and gets passed down, right? And so I think one of the things that I've been wrestling with in my own journey now that I'm a mom is like, what's the sort of intergenerational healing and ancestral healing that I need to do around my family's own experiences and stories? And when we begin to start that process of healing, we begin to tell the truth. And that's just not unique to Black folks, y'all, right? Like that is, I've found across people groups and cultures and ethnic backgrounds, right? Like all of us got stuff in our past, in our family's past, that we don't tend to, but when we tend to the truth of those things, we can begin to see it not as something that conquers us, right? But as something that we can move through and perhaps informs how we might move forward for the generations to follow. So I feel an obligation to do my healing work so that Max won't have to do the same type of healing work moving forward. So that's all of that turned up in me, like, what does it mean to actually sit in the truth and move through it together? I don't think it's something that can be done alone, right? I think too often we do things in isolation and that kills our spirit. But when we do it in community with others, it really helps us move through the reality of our grief, the reality of our trauma, and towards a space of healing, just like those wailing women in the book of Jeremiah. Yeah, sure. Let's see. Hi, everybody joining us online. It's good to see you virtually. It looks like there's a question online. Do you feel church members as a whole support policies of equity in more that hope, but forming alliances with other churches to have an impact through study? Nah, I mean, that was not, I'm sorry. That was not meant to be dismissive at all, anonymous attendee. I do think that every congregation, whether it's a Christian congregation or not, or whether it's not, you know, lots of people, I'm a millennial and Gen Zers, many of us do not affiliate with congregations or formal religious spaces for good reason, often tied to like trauma attached to our engagement in those spaces. And so I think that when I think about the role of religious communities and organizing around, the way to do that best is by taking an internal assessment and true assessment of where you're at first. I think so often, I don't know, am I gonna try to saying this, Ross, but I feel like equity, diversity, inclusion has become like this buzzword, both on college campuses and in some congregations and religious communities. And because it's trendy, folks want to check a box, but don't realize the sort of deep personal transformation work that's necessary to actually get to the core.
Sorry, it was muted for virtual audience. So in answer to your question you just asked now, for me, it's spaces like this. I've been very like blessed my whole life to have more opportunities than most people to have spaces like this where like I truly can see the blossoms of the world through like this community engagement and just like people who are genuine and wanting to do this type of work to actually change the world in face of awful injustices and very much hopelessnesses. And what you had just mentioned about like the buzzwords, and kind of like what came up for me was like this past summer, I feel like there was like part of me was like, oh, like it seems like in the mainstream, like a lot of my friends kind of coming to more of these like radical ideas. But I kind of like realized that maybe that's not really the radical they're talking about, it's more like the political radical that is kind of just more divisive than like truly like bridging those gaps. And so it was like, you know, like I had like little sparks of like, oh, maybe this is it, like this is the time, like we're finally there. But then kind of like realizing, no, it's just like, it seems like it's even more division. Just it's getting doing all this great work, which I feel like is definitely not seen in the mainstream or like not a lot of people are aware of it, and that is like discouraging to a lot of people, and I'm really lucky to see that, and so hopefully we can let people know that this is happening and like there's real like lots of people on it. Work, or maybe that's kind of it has to be handled.
The fact that like I get to serve on staff at a local church in Nashville, so I get to hang out with a lot of old people who remind me of the just keep living baby element of it, right? So one of the things that is beautiful in being an intergenerational community is that you have these moments like last summer where you see these sparks of hope, right? These uncovering moments where you think that you can see the possibility of change. And even though change might be long, I think it's those sparks, those moments that give us the fuel we need to keep going. If what Dr. King said is true, that the mark of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so it also helps me to know that like, I got to do all of that, that like there's a piece of work that is mine to do, and that work and my role might actually change over time. And my commitment to these issues, like I might not always be on the front lines anymore, but I'm making sure like Linda Gilmore that people are getting fed, right? And that part of what I've learned in my own vocational career is that it's okay to sometimes take a step back when the world and the pressures of the world become too much for you, or you've got stuff going on in your personal life. And that there's always an opportunity to step back in. And so that's what I mean by taking care of yourself. And I think that's really what the true meaning of communal care is to be in deep enough community with other people to recognize when you're feeling depleted and you've reached the end of your rope, when there's just too much, like it's too much for you. And moment. Yes, hold on to that moment, because that moment's what's going to get you through some of the hard times too. So thank you so much. What's your name?
Serena.
Serena, nice to meet you, Serena. Thanks for being here. Anyone else? Yeah, oh, here and then back here.
Hi, my name is Amy. I'm a community member, but everything you said resonates profoundly. And you asked the question of what gives us hope. But one of the things that gives me hope is one of the processes you talked about. As things fall apart because they're not based on the dignity of every individual, and they're not based on the development of our innate capacities as we've been created. Those things can't stand and can't sustain us. But what happens is, at least I think I'm seeing this locally in the world, is we step back from those things that don't sustain us and satisfy our souls, which frees us from being part of the things you talked about as your third thing, those things that are rising. And I see it as very good that people are leaving, or there are institutions or groups that haven't satisfied their souls, and creating or finding out. The process we're in is swirling of the world, of the old things falling, people leaving them releases the energy that we can have to build the new things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share a quick story that I think resonates with me. So one of the great gifts, I talk about this in my book, of my life is actually walking with my mom when she was on hospice. She passed away from stage 4 cancer in 2016. And one of the great gifts of walking with someone that's dying is you get to be there during the different phases of death, right? And one of the things that before they finally release and let go. And I think there are a whole lot of people who are gasping for breath right now. Fear of the unknown, demographics, just fear of a lot of things. And so what we see in many cases are people gasping and grasping for power, right? We see people trying to like literally rewrite history books and ban books in Tennessee where I live, right? Like, but all of that is part of the dying process that we're undergoing. And so the question then becomes, for those of us who are dealing with the consequences of bad behavior that then has an implication on our lives, how do we create the muscle of resiliency to move through as people are acting out? And that way to put it, gasping for breath, perhaps, in these last moments before the moment of release, however that release looks. But again,
you hearing from young people?
Sure. So I like to say I spend a lot of time with senior saints and playground prophets. One of the things that is true, so older folks and younger folks, so people who are younger than me. I'm 34, so I'm like very much adjusting to my auntiedom or big cousin, big system, which is a beautiful place to be in a bridging sort of space. And what I hear from the young people that I'm engaging with is two things. One, like some real concerns about the existential crises that are before us. So I hear a lot of concern about climate change. I hear a lot of concern about the racialized wealth gap. I hear a lot of concern around the prison industrial complex, right? They wouldn't use those words necessarily, right? Or those phrases, again, talking about terms and words, right? Like, but they know something's wrong and it's not getting better, and that they feel like older generations aren't necessarily paying attention to the urgency of this moment. But what I also see is like a sophistication and finesse that was not true of my generation and how to fix that. So, and talking with some college students recently, they were thinking, I was talking about economic justice issues and like, how do we make sure that everybody at this particular workplace has access to X, Y, and Z? Their response was, well, we unionize, right? Like, I didn't have that answer. I was still trying, right? I probably should have. There's a way in which I think Gen Zers are coming with like a ferocity, y'all, like the ones in the room. Thank you, the builders, the people who are like, there's a sophistication both in their relationship to technology and what they see and their ability to put things together that I think is going to present us with some really interesting like solutions. They're solutionaries, right? Revolutionaries and solutionaries that are really powerful. And at the same time, because of where they're at in their journey, and that they haven't just been living long enough, there is a sense of like both urgency and hopelessness if like now. And so that's why I actually think there's a deep importance in intergenerational relationships in this moment, and that each generation has something to offer to the existential crises that are before us. And part of what I think older generations might be able to offer folks who are coming behind them is a long view of time that says that they don't have to fix everything right now, that there are things that are urgent, but there also are things that are generational challenges. And so the ability to pace themselves is what's going to be important in this moment. Otherwise, they're going to burn out by the time they're 25. And I've seen people burn out by the time that they're 25. That's why I see like crises of isolation, mental health, right? Like we need resources to be able to help them see the long view and invest in a really meaningful way there.
Hi, my name is Cindy. I have a question that I guess is kind of along the theme of commentary. I think with Gen Z and millennials, there's a huge pressure, especially if you're on social media, to have an opinion about every single thing. I think especially when you're seeing that with like the Russia-Ukraine issue.
Everybody's a foreign policy expert on
Yes,
this.
everyone's a foreign policy expert. We see every time again how we come at it this cross and are actually spreading misinformation. So my question for you, being semi-spot, I don't know how much of like on social media you are, but you are in a spotlight here. How do you deal with those feelings of pressure?
Yeah.
Comment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Here's my most immediate answer to your question is that I don't got time to be on social media because I got a 17-month-old at home who like, when I'm on my phone too long, like will literally snatch it from me. But I hear you asking a deeper question there, which is about this pressure to perform, and this pressure to perform expertise in this moment, particularly online, that I see back to this question of generations. Like, I see a lot of like my mentees and folks who are younger than me, my teachers who are younger than me, struggling with, at a time when like folks' lives are so perfectly curated online. Part of that curation seems to be the need to express expertise in things that you don't have expertise in. But I think that's part of maybe a larger cultural challenge that we're facing, in that people feel the pressure to have to be experts and to know everything right now. And so what I would like to see, I have a really good friend who takes a tech Sabbath every week, right? Like literally there's 24 hours where he's just offline, that there are ways in which there is a need for us to normalize unplugging, to be able to like pause and reflect on the world. Because I do think part of the challenge that we're facing is this rapid, like back and forth communication. We can't have a civil discourse if all we have is like 180 characters to communicate with one another, right? Or where we incentivize division or incentivize conflict rather than moving forward or promoting, even in journalism, right? Like what sells newspapers? Conflict, not solutions. And so I think there is a need both individually for us to unplug, because social media will drive you crazy if you stay on it too much, and culturally for us to unplug, right? And to begin thinking about how we might leverage and amplify. Maybe it's doing the healing work to figure out within ourselves in this country why we prioritize conflict and incentivize conflict over stories of cooperation. That's some like healing tending work. But then there's a question for me too about like structurally how we incentivize that. So, yeah.
Pastor Jen, I'm struck by the fact that you talk a lot about doing work together in community. In this community, we're experiencing a pretty significant level of gun violence. And there are a number of pastors and other good leaders and activists in the room who are trying to figure out how to do that work together, to do it again, to come together to combat and to support and to figure out what to do. I think you need radical hope, right? I'm wondering what advice you might give to a community that is working, beginning to do the work of figuring out how to do work together.
Investing in the front end on the relationships you have with one another. So there's a really famous Stephen Covey quote that says relationships move at the speed of trust. In my work, I've also found that social change moves at the speed of relationships. So if we aren't doing the tending to like actually get to know one another, to get to know one of those stories, I co-founded a project several years ago called the People's Supper that was all about bringing people together over dinner to just hear one another and to figure of speech around issues in the community. And what we found is that like that relational tending, like I don't want to organize with you if I don't like you. I'm just gonna be real with you, right? Or, you know, there are some people I can organize with that I don't like because we have shared interests, right? But when we're talking about building a long game to addressing challenges in our community, maybe I don't need to like you, but I want to know you, right? I want to know that you are someone that I can trust. And so my advice would be like, tend to the relational, tend to like really spending the time that may not be all about, organizing the next campaign push or sending that next communication out via social media, right? But like getting coffee with one another, asking how, knowing the names of people's kids, right? Like that is the sort of community building block that one of the pastors that we worked with at Faith Matters Network at North Carolina, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which if folks don't know, about a year ago had it was in the news after an unarmed shooting of a Black man by police. And the reason that community didn't fall apart is because, in the words of Reverend Leach, they built trust before tragedy, right? They had this relationship that local congregations built together, and they trusted one another so that when the storm came, it wasn't that they were picking up and calling a stranger, it's that they were picking up and calling a friend that they knew well. And so I was invest in one another, invest in getting to know one another if you're going to be in this work long haul, and also invest in learning the discipline, and this is hard, of like how you move through moments of harm towards repair. Because here's the thing, we're human, and so we're going to mess up, right? We're not always going to get everything right. We're gonna hurt each other's feelings. We're gonna say some messed up things out of the space of our own woundedness sometimes. But figuring out what it looks like then to move through that harm, not ignore it, address it, and move through so you might be transformed on the other end of it, that feels like discipline to me, right? That not giving up on one another is probably the hardest thing that so many people in movement space is really easy to dismiss. It's really easy to walk away. And I also will caveat that with, unless this is a case of like abuse, in which case not, like clear boundaries are needed, like you shouldn't be forced to be in a relationship with people who are abusive. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question. Anyone else? I know it's 1 o'clock, so we're wrapping up, but I'm gonna hang out up here for a while. Please come talk to me. I'm around for the next couple of days. I'm in my home state, so I'm really excited about that. Awesome. Oh, hey, yeah, I love that.
One of the things I just spoke about was resilience, and I think about the end or the requirement for folks who are on the margins, historic history, because of traditions, and the expectation for continued resilience during this time, while simultaneously having to navigate the various harms that come at the interpersonal level, at the systemic level, and that causes folks to be tired and to feel drained. And so what would you advise, or what would you advise folks who have been on the margins or on the margins to hold on to hope, to continue to be resilient while feeling drained and feeling tired, as we're going on?
Yeah, so I'm reminded, so I identify as a womanist, which is a stream of Black feminist theology and thought that grounds the everyday experiences of Black women, the way that we see the world and about. And her definition of womanism, Alice Walker talks about being communitarian, but also a separatist and for reasons of health at times, right? And so to folks who exist on the margins and whose identities place them on the margins, sometimes we gotta be a separatist for reasons of health. What that means is like, go take a nap. And not just a nap, but like, go be with your people, go tend to the group chat, right? But like, it is sometimes unethical to ask certain populations to bridge all the time, right? Because sometimes people just need to be, and that sometimes is the radical work. And so for folks who are tired, I see your tiredness. I see it, name it, I acknowledge it, and invite you into rest. The work will remain. And I know it's particularly hard for the Black women in my community. I think about my mom's own story. Like, I think one of the reasons why she got sick so young was because she was always doing for others and pouring into others and not into herself. And so I feel really strongly about having an ethic and rhythm of rest, of Shabbat, right, in the Jewish tradition as part of our practice, and that season is as important to renewing and rejuvenating our imagination and our creativity as anything else. So that's what I would say to folks is like, both those on the margins and those who aren't, incorporate rhythms of rest into your work so that you might be replenished. So, thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much. I want to point out at the table outside, there's a flyer for the full Arabic conference. So tonight at 5 o'clock, actually speaking of Shabbat, at 5:45 at the very listed our feet is a Shabbat dinner that's going to kick off the whole conference, and that is sponsored in part by Alana Hillel. They're going to be talking about Carly Burak from Alana Hillel is going to be talking about the practice of rest and why that's important, and what does it mean to set aside 25 hours for rest, and what would that look like. So that will be our first event, and also 7 o'clock is the opening session where Jen will talk a little bit more about radical hope. And then tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., Jen and Ira are going to talk about collective care and wellness. So hopefully you'll be able to join us, but you can register at the QR code or the link that's on here. So
let me just say, Ira is my husband group. It's going to be really fun. Yeah, come on.
how much do you all present together? How often do you?
This is our first time presenting with one another ever. So please come on out. It'll be really fun, I promise.
Great. Thank you all so much.